I'm glad to welcome to the meeting house today Dr. Jemar Tisby. I'm going to ask him to join me up here.
Hey.
This is your first visit to the meeting house.
It is.
I hope it's not the last.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Especially if you keep writing books like this.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
2019, the book came out, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism.
Nice, fun, light reading. Absolutely.
You know, like a lot of people over the last 10 years, I've read a lot of books on this subject. There's not a book better than yours.
Ooh, thank you. I appreciate that.
No, I'm very serious about this. I read Cast. I read Willie Francois. Do you know Willie Francois up in New Jersey?
Not personally, but I know of him.
He was in the meeting house about 6 months ago.
Oh, great.
Yeah. This is really good. It's you go through the history of life on North America, way back before the Revolution.
That's right.
And you talk about the role of racism all the way up until 2018, I guess, when you finished writing this thing.
That's right. That's right.
A lot's happened since then, too.
It's one thing to write about history. It's another to live through it.
To live through it, and we all have lived through it. Well, the piece about this book that I am so interested in, you highlight the great religious revivals of our history. The 17th century Great Awakening in New England, Jonathan Edwards. The 18th century great revival that started out here at Cambridge.
Right.
The Pentecostal movement of the 19th century, and then the post-war evangelical boom
that we're all still dealing with.
We're all still dealing with.
Yeah.
And here is my question. None of these powerful religious events had the power to deal adequately with racism in America, have they?
Yeah, it's one of those things where this is where people ask, I think legitimately, the question, is Christianity the white man's religion? Because, as you said, all of these, awakenings and movements and revivals didn't seem to shake enough people out of this idolatry of racism. And there's a lot of sort of sociological reasons behind that. But what I find interesting is the Black Christian tradition in the United States is explicitly a response to racial injustice. And so I think we have too narrow a view when we ask that question, is Christianity the white man's religion? Because it excludes so many other people, including white folks, who understood Christianity as a force of liberation and equality and not one of repression.
Well, the question I have is, 4 times now in our history, powerful religious movements had enormous social impact. Does Christianity itself have the capacity to overcome the racism in our country? Can it even do it? It's had 4 tries.
At least, yep.
At least 4.
Yep.
Does it have the capacity to do it?
So Howard Thurman, the great theologian, Black theologian, asked that question. He said, is there something about inherent in Christianity that actually leads to these oppressions, that actually leads to these injustices, and can it possibly, right?
That's right.
This is in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited. Ultimately, he comes down on the side of yes, it can. I think one of the things that we have to do is define success, right? Because if success is particular laws being changed, if success is, everyone having these racially egalitarian views. I don't think we're going to find that kind of success. We'll be very disappointed.
Anywhere in the world?
Probably
Is this
not.
true of all religions?
I don't know. I only have experience firsthand with Christianity.
Go on with your statement. I don't mean to.
So I think a big part of this is, and I think this would span religions, is in the pursuit of justice. It's not just what we accomplish externally, it's how it changes us internally. In other words, it's who you become as you pursue the good of your neighbor. And I think when we look at that, we can look at wins and successes and progress and victories. It's been extremely encouraging to me. I always get the question like, how do you keep going? What gives you hope kind of thing. It is the community of the discontent. It is that group of people who are dissatisfied with the status quo in whatever area, and they're working for change. And we are constantly the underdog, right? Almost never a majority, almost never the ones in power.
And by we, you mean?
The people striving for freedom, the people striving for justice.
It could be
right?
racism, but it could be other.
It could be climate change. It could be gender equality. It could be any of these things, right? So if you look at it, though, the Bible uses the analogy of a mustard seed, right? And it starts out as the tiniest seed in the garden, but it grows and its branches can give shelter to many creatures. And I think we have to have a sort of mustard seed mentality that it's never going to be a majority of people or a large group of people that are pushing for these changes. But on the other side, it doesn't have to be. That great change can come about from a small group of committed people.
And you're talking about the change socially, culturally.
That's right.
As well as, you said a minute ago, the change on the inside of us.
That's right, that's right.
When you mentioned that, of course, I grew up in West Kentucky.
Okay. I'm new to Kentucky. I won't know any place you're naming.
Okay. But well, this is probably true with just about any part of Kentucky. I grew up during the 60s. I was a teenager throughout the whole 60s.
All right.
All that drama of music, rock and roll, sex, civil rights, Vietnam, all of that was going on.
Yep.
But
were you one of the long-haired,
no,
beard?
I never was, but I've got longer hair now than I had in the 60s.
Just had to check, whether you were one of those
Did you ever
rabble-rousers.
have long hair? Huh?
I did. I had an afro.
You had the afro?
Yes,
Actually,
absolutely.
so did I. I could do the afro, too.
We're going to have to look at those pictures side by side.
No, we don't want to look at those pictures. But, of course, my white culture, segregation started while I was in school. There were two preacher boys in my high school. One was at the black church. I was at the white church. But nothing was ever said in church, in school, about any of this.
That's the thing. That's the thing.
We saw it on television, but we never engaged it at the church. We never engaged it. And now as I engage it, my attitudes have changed, but I'll have to confess many of my instincts have not.
Right. Yeah. Well, it makes sense because it's designed that way, right? Some people call it white supremacy. I think another way to think of it is white centrality, white centeredness. It's baked in to everything we do. The analogy I give is I went to seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, got a master's in divinity, and we studied theology, of course. And all theology was just theology until it was black theology, Latin American theology, Asian American theology, right? It had to have an adjective and a label.
Unless it was the default position, which was white
exactly.
theology.
It's the default position in everything, right? So it would be natural that your reflex is that, right? Even for black people, there's this thing called internalized racism where we absorb these messages of white centrality. So for instance, part of choosing that seminary, which was almost all white, was, they have the better theology, right? We talked about it on our podcast, Pass the Mic, where we get enculturated to think that everything that's white or majority white is varsity, and everything everyone else does is JV,
Yeah.
right? And you got to work your way up to the varsity level. So
This is true with womanist theology as well, and feminist theology. We assume it's not only white, but it's male.
Exactly.
And that's the default position when
Yep.
you say we're doing theology.
Exactly. So yeah, it is baked in like that. And what you said about, and we never talked about it, right? I think that's the critical portion. So the book is called The Color of Compromise, and in the subtitle is the word complicity. And a lot of people think that's too weak. Those words don't get at the very proactive, vociferous, intentional ways that white Christians have created and maintained racism and white supremacy. All of that's true. But when you look at sort of any social movement, the extremes are always the smallest proportion. So the people putting on hoods, making nooses, all of that, numerically speaking, it's a very small portion. But how does that stuff happen? So I start the book talking about the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing where 4 little girls were killed, right? And what's so interesting to me is that there was already a neighborhood in Birmingham nicknamed Bombingham, that there had already been bombings prior to that. And this white lawyer who I talk about in the introduction, Charles Morgan Jr., he cites that and says, look, this has happened before. If we had stood up, particularly as people of faith, maybe we could have prevented it. So that's what I'm getting at with this idea of compromise and complicity. In so many cases, it's not the overt acts that are the most egregious, or put it this way, those overt acts of racism, even the most violent ones, can only happen within a context of complicity. Oftentimes that complicity looks like silence. So I talk a lot about my conversion to Christianity. It's a classic evangelical conversion story. If I was white, like you just check every box, right?
Right.
But it was a high school youth group. You know, they had sports, they had food, they had girls, everything a high school guy was excited about, right? Leads to conversion, right? At least kept you coming. And so
Where was this?
this is in the north suburbs of Chicago. I'm a Midwest guy.
Yeah.
And there'd be these little 15-minute sermonettes, and, you know, along the way it made sense. I did the sinner's prayer, all that stuff. And I've come to understand that, and it's a white evangelical youth group, seeker-sensitive movement, if you know anything about that. I've come to understand that my passion for racial justice, particularly in regards to religion, doesn't come from the fact that I had such bad experiences of community. I actually had such positive experiences of community, and I want that to extend. But to the extent that I ever felt excluded or not one of, it was because of race. And here's how it showed up. It didn't. So it's not that people were running around calling me the N-word or saying, oh, your skin is different, you can't play with us. It's not that. It was that it was never a topic. It never came up. My reality of being black in America, being a black male teenager in those days, of any of the issues from anti-black police brutality to you name it, that just wasn't on the radar. And it made me feel invisible. And so oftentimes I think the issue is not those acts of real overt in-your-face racism, but the silence.
So what do you wish had happened?
Yeah.
What would have been a better way forward? How could you or others around you have precipitated what you felt missing?
Well, I think, number one, I think it didn't show up because these folks didn't know about it, didn't know what to say. So the leaders would have had to educate themselves.
Was this an all-white group?
Pretty much. It was always like me and maybe 1 or 2 others. You could count on one hand, yeah. And they would have had to know, because this is the suburbs, middle class, all of that stuff. So there's every barrier for them not to know. So you would have to be very intentional about, not just reading or watching documentaries, that's important, but sociology tells us it's not your one black friend or your one friend of color that makes a difference. What makes a difference is you have a network of people who are racially and ethnically different from you. And then you get exposure to not just one singular viewpoint, then you get exposure to the different realities and priorities. So that's one thing the leaders would have had to know. The other thing is they would have had to talk about it in the main group, not just some special sidebar conversation. It would have had to come up in those little sermonettes. It would have had to come up in the Bible study materials, whatever it might be, right? So, I mean, I'm a 90s kid growing up in the Chicago area. Michael Jordan is the GOAT. You can't tell me different. It just is what it is. But in those days, you know, we weren't that far from the Rodney King, you know, beating and trial. Like, that could have come up, all of that stuff.
And it never did.
Never did.
So, in a group like this, you were a distinct minority. How many black participants does it take in a group to make these conversations part of the conversations?
So the sort of social scientific definition of multi-ethnic is no singular group is more than 80% of the group, right? So at least 20% are of a different race and ethnicity. So that helps because it's hard to ignore, right? But honestly, if the leadership is on board, it could be a very small number of people. And actually, I tell churches that are all white, because there's plenty of those. I've spoken several times in, not my plans, but I've spoken several times in Iowa, which is one of the whitest states in the country. It's like 90% white. There's just demographically going to be numerous faith communities that just don't have people of color because of who's there.
That's right.
But you can still talk about it. You can still equip your people to understand racial justice, especially because they might leave. They might go to some place where there are people of color.
Well, in Iowa, the minority group would be Hispanic.
That's right, that's right. A large and growing population, yeah.
I pastor a micro church in Hendersonville, North Carolina. 2.5% of our county population is black, 15+% is Hispanic.
Yep.
So that has become the dominant minority group in many, many places in the country. Do they have the same experience as minorities?
It's always different, but it all does tend to center on white supremacy, white-centeredness, right? So first of all, there's immigrant experience is a little bit different than African American who's born here, languages, things of that nature. But a lot of the principles are the same, especially when it comes to, I think what it comes down to is making sure everyone feels included in some way, shape, or form, right? So whether that's having a Spanish language service, learning about Latin American liberation theologians.
Having a translator?
Having a translator, what books are on your shelf to help understand where
what images are in the room?
100%.
What songs are being sung?
Yep.
What illustrations are being used, whether it's coming out of a minority context or a majority context.
Sí, es la verdad. Sí.
What did you say? See?
Yeah, it's all, yeah. See, yes, it's all true. Truth, yes.
Okay, I want to ask you about this because you talk about this in your book, something that I have lived with still. One of the ways that the evangelical world, in which both you and I were both formed and shaped.
Yeah, by the way, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary right here in Louisville is kind of the heart of a lot of it. Yes.
I spent a lot of time there, believe me. They deal with this great tension between spiritualizing the transformation or socializing it. That is, we're either working for social justice or we're working to change your heart.
Right.
Making it everything, let's just get everybody saved one at a time, they would say. And that's the solution. So that tension exists.
Yes.
how can we, as both of us, and broadly speaking, as part of the evangelical world, where is the balance? Where is the intersection of these two things?
That's good. So the, sort of the spiritual and the material,
Yeah.
that's typically been a dichotomy in a lot of evangelical spaces. And just because I'm a historian, I got to go to history. So at one point, people asked, what's an evangelical? And the answer was someone who likes Billy Graham. And Billy Graham is a great example of sort of mid-20th century evangelicalism. He was the guy. And so a lot of people looked at Billy Graham as a racial moderate or even racially progressive. It was all the way back in '53 that he took down the ropes segregating black and white. So that's before Brown v. Board, right?
Absolutely.
Like, wow. Yes, so, that was way ahead of a lot of people, but let's be honest, the bar's pretty low when it came to mid-20th century white evangelicals. But Billy Graham, to your point, his method was one heart at a time.
Yeah.
If we focus on evangelism, if we focus on conversion, then people who follow Christ will become better people and they won't have hate in their hearts and they'll treat black people better. Michael Emerson and Christian Smith, in their book Divided by Faith, which I highly recommend, they call this the miracle motif. So it's the miracle of conversion along with the miracle of not being racist once you become a Christian. But to your point, that didn't tend to happen with a lot of white people. So again, I think the Black Christian tradition is instructive because there's always been that marriage of the spiritual and the material. And so there was a 19th century Black abolitionist minister in Florida who said a minister cannot do his whole duty, but that he looks out for the political interests of his people. Isn't that interesting? So actually a lot of elected officials in Reconstruction and after were black ministers because they couldn't effectively minister to black people without also advocating for the laws and policies and material changes that would help their congregation. Now, what's so interesting here is the nuance that we have to get is that white Christians and white evangelicals have always been selective when they've split the spiritual and the material, right? So we can think of issues like abortion, the military, whatever it might be, where they're perfectly willing.
Abortion's a really good example of this.
They're perfectly willing to lobby, to raise money, to
change the law.
Because of a spiritual conviction. But the line was always drawn when it came to race. Then, if you're looking at changing a law to be more fair, more egalitarian, no, that's a political issue.
Yeah.
We're the church, we got to stay out of it.
So how do they justify this this difference of strategy?
They don't see it.
They don't see it,
most
do they?
of the time. But we also have to talk about the role of money in all of this.
Let's talk about it.
I don't think we dwell on that enough. A lot of people say, and I think I write in the book, but a lot of people say that America's original sin was slavery. And I say that America's original symptom was slavery, and its original sin was greed. Because what drove slavery? So it's so interesting, right? In history, there's this idea called contingency, which is simply that what came to be wasn't inevitable. So when those 20 and odd Negroes arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia in 1619, there was no slave code at that point. There was no racially based system of unfree labor at that point, although they basically lived and died in slavery once they got here. There wasn't this sharp line between, say, indentured servitude and race-based housing. That developed over centuries, really, and people could have made different choices along the way. So it didn't necessarily have to be race-based. It could have just been based on class or what country of origin, whatever. Anyway, all of that to say that what made slavery so sticky, the fact that we had to have a civil war to abolish it, was because there was money to be made.
By North and South.
North and South. It's and international.
Internationally,
Yeah,
Great Britain, the whole triangle of the
Right.
trade.
So what happened was, first of all, we're coming up on Columbus Day. And it's important to remember that Europeans would have just been decimated and wiped out had not Native Americans helped them. They would not have made a profit, which the colonies were profit-making ventures. That's why it wasn't just this like exploration. Let's find this. It's not Star Trek, right? To seek out brave new worlds, right? No, that wasn't it. It was
They were looking for the gold.
this was
weren't
venture capitalism, right? So they wouldn't have turned a profit had the enslaved Africans they brought over not brought over their methods for cultivating rice and other crops and things of that nature. So once it became apparent, hey, we can make a lot of money here. And then 1796, 94, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. Now we can ramp up production. We also have different strains of cotton that grow better. I lived in the Delta of Arkansas. That is cotton country. If you picture fields of cotton, that's where it is.
was.
And so once, to your point, that everybody was connected, so this is around the Industrial Revolution. So now we can mass produce products. If you needed a new dress, it wasn't you were home spinning this in your house. Now there's a factory set up. You can produce thousands of dresses, but guess what? Now we need fabric. Fabric comes from cotton. Cotton needs to be picked by enslaved people, right? So you're connecting people across the Atlantic world. And what's so interesting is the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, they're building off ideas of the Enlightenment. What's happening during the Enlightenment is a decoupling of government and God, right? In some ways healthy, but also John Locke, who's one of the big, progenitors of the Constitutional Declaration of Independence kind of ideals, he's saying that the government is there to protect property rights. And what are enslaved people considered? Property. So this is the argument slave owners are making, is that enslaved people, even though they're people, they're my property. The government's job is to protect my property. If you're not going to protect my property, Abraham Lincoln, they didn't like him, then we're going to split off and we're going to fight for it.
So the question that comes to my mind as I listen to you talk about the connection between money and slavery, what is the connection today between money and racism that we're dealing with today? People will say, well, we've made great progress since 150 years.
That's a great question.
But is there still this connection? Are people getting wealthy off of the racist policies in America now?
There we go. So one of the things I say in the book is that racism never goes away, it just adapts. So a lot of people can look at, 1964 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act, 68 Fair Housing Act. Racism's over. No. One of the things I say is there's a kind of sociological physics at play where, objects in motion stay in motion unless acted upon by another object, right? So that is to say there is a force of history, a momentum of history that even after these laws have been passed, a lot of that racism continues on today because of the momentum of hundreds of years of these practices. So you asked about money. I think the most direct descendant or legacy of race-based chattel slavery today is the prison system. More broadly, the criminal legal system. Notice I said legal, not justice, right? Because there is no other corollary that more directly physically controls black bodies than policing, courts, jails, prisons, and executions, right? So there's money to be made in the prison systems. Not only are there for-profit prisons, the prison system in general generates revenue for state governments and local governments and whatnot. So that's one direct descendant. Another is many white institutions, including white churches and denominations, they already have the money. So they don't have to accumulate more, they just have to keep it. So this is like a lot of the opposition to something like reparations or any sort of financial redistribution of funds, which, by the way, the Bible would call ill-gotten gains in a lot of cases. So now it becomes a question of who has the resources. And so the organization I started, The Witness, a Black Christian collective, we struggled mightily and still do to raise funds and put on conferences or events or pay for our podcast, right? But if we were to go to some of these historically white denominations or organizations, they spend more money on paper clips than we have for an annual budget, right? Like, so that's what it's looking like today.
I want to conclude with a story. I sat down after reading your book and tried to make a list of some of the places where there has been progress. And you mentioned Michael Jordan the other day. They announced this week that he's now is worth, what, $3 billion?
$3 billion. First black athlete on the Forbes 400 list.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's another story. My wife and I own a home in Glenn County, Georgia. This is Brunswick, Georgia.
Okay.
The week that I launched my radio show of the Meeting House in Brunswick was the week that Ahmaud Arbery was murdered. No, we didn't know about it when I started the show. My first guest was the mayor, a black man, and another guest, the president of the NAACP in Glenn County. Here is a story of 3 white men tracked down a black man who was doing nothing, and they killed him. I was cynical from the get-go that he would ever be arrested, that they would ever be prosecuted, let alone found guilty.
Right.
And I think all of us in Georgia were shocked that even in what appeared to be an open and shut case of the law, that these 3 men were found guilty at the state level and the federal level. You started a few minutes ago talking about the bombing in Birmingham, where the men were all arrested, all tried before a white jury, all exonerated. But here we are, 60 years later, these 3 white men are going to serve pretty much the rest of their life in state jail for these crimes.
Yep.
There has been some progress.
Yes, and we have to look at those points of light, right, to keep going. It is interesting in those cases, like we needed video evidence, we needed a practical confession from one of the guys beforehand. But the level of evidence is still pretty high, but we will take what we can get.
That's right. The Color of Compromise. It is a great book. It's the kind of book that our kids ought to be reading in school. It's the kind of book that the people ought to be reading in church, don't you think?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Did you bring any copies with you tonight?
I actually do have some copies. Yes.
We want to sell them for you tonight.
Very good, very good.
We need to put them over there on the table along with my book.
Will do, yes.
Which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. Thank you for coming into the Meeting House tonight.
Absolutely.